The system is flawed, straight up flawed. The system is flawed. And I'm not just talking about the penitentiary. I'm talking about the streets as well. The systems I see at work out here are flawed. The point is, if you want to beat the system, you have to become the system. Become the system. Become the system. I've been in the worst situations, the worst, and still managed to thrive. When I was in the BMU, after I got an A1 assault charge in the penitentiary.
With interest. Some 2 years ago, the Senate Health Subcommittee heard chilling testimony about the human experimentation activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Deputy Director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens.
To facilitate our getting all of the information that both of your committees need into the record, we have on a subject known as Project MKUltra, a project which took place from 1953 to 1964. It was an umbrella project under which there were numerous sub-projects for research, among other things, on drugs and behavioral modification. The most significant new data that has been discovered are first, the names of researchers and institutions who participated in MKUltra projects, and secondly, a possibly improper contribution by CIA to a private institution. We are now in the possession of the names of 185 non-government researchers and assistants who are identified in the recovered material dealing with these 149 sub-projects. There are also names of 80 institutions where work was done or with which these people were affiliated. The institutions include 44 colleges or universities, 15 research foundations or chemical or pharmaceutical companies or the like, 12 hospitals or clinics, in addition to those associated with the universities, and 3 penal institutions. And 3 penal institutions.
Mendoza, you've been selected to be enrolled in the Lister program. It's a surgery to remove the front part of the brain that controls the violence. It's a government-funded program.
Now why would I give you the best part of me?
Because you're the perfect candidate.
Federal prison officials have just confirmed termination of the controversial Lister program. You may recall that partial lobotomies were to be performed on most violent inmates in the prison system. Although officials insist participation is completely voluntary, protests and legal action have led to permanent shutdown of this medical procedure. Rachel?
Mind control. What is it? And how has it been utilized on people in the prison system? And how has it evolved into something that is now being used in the general public?
Breaking Men's Minds, Behavior Control and Human Experimentation at the Federal Prison in Marion. By Eddie Griffin. Having spent a total of 2.5 years in this experimental behavior laboratory-type fortress, I have witnessed atrocities that are on the same par as Pinochet's concentration camps in Chile and that of Hitler's Auschwitz. Victor Bono, Marion captive. Throughout the state and federal prison systems, there are circulating stories and hearsay about the Marion, Illinois federal prison. These tales weave their way through the grapevine and, over a period of time and distance, become mystique and legendary, especially among young prisoners making their unfortunate debut into the system. For example, in 1972 at Terre Haute Federal Prison, it was not uncommon to hear young prisoners unfold myths about an underground prison called Marion, where those who entered would never see the sun again until their release. Others would claim the control unit at Marion was underground, and whoever was placed there would spend the rest of their sentence in it. No one really knew for sure because, up until then, no prisoner returned to Terre Haute from Marion. Real or unreal, a dread grew up around the myths. Whatever existed behind the walls of Marion generated apprehension of a legal form of assassination. Prison officials at other institutions cultivate and exploit these fears by threatening to send certain resistive prisoners to Marion. A man is told to conform to the institution, or he will be sent to Marion to have his behavior corrected.
The point is, if you want to beat the system, you have to become the system.
The thought of being corrected by unknown means has a chilling effect on the senses, and it tends to sterilize any resistance which might exist in prison populations. Evidently, Marion was a control mechanism for the entire prison system, a penal cesspool where other institutions discarded their waste. I was one of the so-called incorrigibles who had come into conflict with Terre Haute officials, and I was threatened with being sent to Marion. After receiving an injury in the prison machine shop, where I narrowly missed losing a finger, I was patched up, administered a painkiller, and then sent back to work. Soon afterwards, there was almost a repeat of the same accident, so I decided to quit my work in the machine shop. I was immediately locked up in segregation for refusing to work, and for 8 months, I continuously refused to work until I was guaranteed a job change. But the administration declared that they would use me wherever they needed me.
We tell him to button his lip and fucking work, earn his shit. I hate when people say they feel off. Oh, I'm having an off day.
Prisoners do not control their institution. My insistence about the work hazard led to my being shipped to Marion, no doubt to have my obstinate behavior corrected. A behavior modification laboratory. Upon first glance, Marion differed radically in its appearance from what one would believe from the horrid myths. The ominous sword of Damocles over the prison system appeared to be no threat. But the human eye can be deceived by what is contracted on the phenomenal level. A vague but bleak sensation invades a man's being when he passes through the grill doors into the prison's interior. Each electronically controlled grill seems to alienate him more and more from his freedom, even the hope of freedom. A sense of finality, of being buried alive, is raised to the super level of his consciousness. He tries to suppress it, but the clanging of each door leaves an indelible imprint on his psyche. This is the first evidence that Marion is more than a physical star chamber. It is a modem behavior modification laboratory. Behavior modification at Marion consists of a manifold of 4 techniques. 1. Drive, Edgar H. Schein's brainwashing methodology. 2. Skinnerian operant conditioning. 3. Dr. Levinson's sensory deprivation design, i.e. control unit, and 4. Chemotherapy and drug therapy. And, as I will point out, the use of these techniques, the way they are disguised behind pseudonyms and under the philosophical rhetoric of correction, and even their modus operandi, violate the Nuremberg Code, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare Policy on Human Experimentation, and the First, Sixth and Eighth Amendments to the United States Constitution.
So he pulls out a hypodermic, swabs my arm, injects the nectine intravenously instead of intramuscularly. It goes straight to the vein. Immediately upon injection, your body goes into a convulsive, just spasmic, say 4 to 5 seconds, a spasmic attack. And then the body's immobilized. It's a feeling of being suffocated with pillows on your face, and at the same time of having an enormous amount of weight on your chest, where that you can't breathe. It's a feeling of total paralysis of your hands, your arms, your legs, your toes. You can't move anything. You can move your eyes slightly.
The constructs of the prison are somewhat peculiar. Some not so outstanding features do not make the least economical sense, and are often totally out of physiological order. But these features, when viewed from a psychological angle, begin to take on new meaning. For example, the prison is minced into small sections and subsections, divided by a system of electronic and mechanical grills further reinforced by a number of strategically locked steel doors. Conceivably, the population can be sectioned off quickly in times of uprising. But even for the sake of security, the prison is laced with too many doors. Every few feet a prisoner is confronted by one. So he must await permission to enter or exit at almost every stop. A man becomes peeved. But this is augmented by the constant clanging that bombards his brain so many times a day until his nervous system becomes knotted. The persistent reverberation tends to resurrect and reinforce the same sensation, the same bleak feeling that originally introduced the individual into the Marion environment. It is no coincidence. This system is designed with conscious intent. Every evening the control movement starts. The loudspeakers, which are scattered around the prison, resonate the signal. The movement is on. You have 10 minutes to make your move. The interior grille doors are opened, but the latitude and limits of a man's mobility are sharply defined, narrowly constricted. His motion, the fluidity of his life, is compressed between time locks. There is a sense of urgency to do what prisoners usually do, nothing. It is just a matter of time before the last remnants of a prisoner's illusion become obliterated. At the end of the 10-minute limit, the speakers blare out, "The movement is over. Clear the corridor." The proceedings stop. 20 minutes later the routine is repeated, and so on, until a man's psyche becomes conditioned to the movement/non-movement regimentation, and his nerves jingle with the rhythmic orchestration of steel clanging steel. In prisoners' words, it is part of the program, part of the systematic process of reinforcing the unconditional fact of a prisoner's existence, that he has no control over the regulation and orientation of his own being. In behavioral psychology, this condition is called learned helplessness, a derivative of Skinnerian operant conditioning, commonly called learning techniques. In essence, a prisoner is taught to be helpless, dependent on his overseer. He is taught to accept without question the overseer's power to control him.
Right. We go out to the yard, we build that youngster into the man he needs to be. We tell him to button his lip and fucking work, earn his shit.
This rebels against human consciousness, so some prisoners seek means of resistance. Others try to circumnavigate the omnipotent force via escape. But the omnipotent is also omnipresent. Nothing escapes Marion's elaborate network of eyes. Between television monitors, prisoner spies, collaborators, and prison officials, every crevice of the prison is overlaid by a constant watch. Frontline officers specially trained in the cold, calculated art of observation, watch prisoners' movements with a particular meticulousness, scrutinizing little details and behavior patterns, then recording them in the log book. This aid provides the staff with a means to manipulate certain individuals' behavior. It is feasible to calculate a prisoner's level of sensitivity from the information, so his vulnerability can be tested with a degree of precision. Some behavior modification experts call these tests stress assessment.
And I'm in my cell by myself. All I have is a floor towel, just a floor towel. And they're bringing me by books that have the endings ripped out of them. I'm not even bullshitting. If anything is the most evil thing you could do to someone, it's give them multiple books with the endings ripped out. The fucking endings ripped out. You're finally getting in the zone. You're finally getting into some flow state on this book, and you get to the end, you're like, oh, motherfucker, there's no ending. Over and over. I don't know why they were so sick. But
prisoners call it harassment. In some cases, selected prisoners are singled out for one or several of these differential treatment tactics. A prisoner could have his male turned back or accidentally mutilated. He could become the object of regular searches, or even his visitors could be strip searched. These and more tactics are consistent with those propagated by one Dr. Edgar H. Schein. A history of this behavior modification laboratory. At a Washington, D.C. conference in 1962 organized for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, BOP, by the National Institutes of Mental Health, Schein presented his ideas on brainwashing. Addressing the topic of man against man, brainwashing, he stated, "In order to produce marked changes of behavior and/or attitude, it is necessary to weaken, undermine or remove the supports to the old patterns of behavior and the old attitudes. Because most of these supports are the face-to-face confirmation of present behavior and attitudes, which are provided by those with whom close emotional ties exist, it is often necessary to break those emotional ties. This can be done either by removing the individual physically and preventing any communication with those whom he cares about, or by proving to him that those whom he respects aren't worthy of it and, indeed, should be actively mistrusted." Dr. Schein then provided the group with a list of specific examples: physical removal of prisoners from areas sufficiently isolated to effectively break or seriously weaken close emotional ties; segregation of all natural leaders.
I was validated as an Aryan Brotherhood member, and I went up to Pelican Bay, and there I stayed until 2006 in the long corridor, which was with other prisoners, other general population inmates that were in the SHU that had determined SHU programs for killings and stabbings that weren't considered to be gang connected. But then they, in 2006, started a short corridor, and some call it the gang corridor, short corridor with 4 cell blocks in it. And they open that up for just validated members and isolate us even further from the other prisoners in the SHU.
Use of cooperative prisoners as leaders. Prohibition of group activities not in line with brainwashing objectives, spying on prisoners and reporting back private material. tricking men into written statements which are then showed to others, exploitation of opportunists and informers, convincing prisoners that they can trust no one, treating those who are willing to collaborate in far more lenient ways than those who are not.
Crazy yeah. You know what I mean? Fucking, I didn't even let the Hoodas lock my gate at that time. You know what I'm saying?
Damn.
Well, it's the county jail. Like our county jail, if you got it like that, you got it like that. You know? If the Hoodas know you handle business, you take care of trash that's coming in, meaning like anybody that's not good. You know what I'm saying? They'll let you fucking roam, man. You know what I mean? Long story short, I was in the county so long at that time fighting my case. You know, when you're in a place for so long, you become a part of it. Meaning like you become staff without even wanting to. You know what I'm saying? So at one point, the cops in the theater already knew that we were with the business because, believe it or not, in the LA County Jail, the cops participate in all action that goes on. You know what I'm saying?
Punishing those who show uncooperative attitudes. Systematic withholding of mail. Preventing contact with anyone non-sympathetic to the method of treatment and regimen of the captive populace. Disorganization of all group standards among prisoners. Building a group conviction among the prisoners that they have been abandoned by and totally isolated from their social order. Undermining of all emotional supports. Preventing prisoners from writing home or to friends in the community regarding the conditions of their confinement. Making available and permitting access to only those publications and books that contain materials which are neutral to or supportive of the desired new attitudes. Placing individuals into new and ambiguous situations for which the standards are kept deliberately unclear. And then putting pressure on him to conform to what is desired in order to win favor and a reprieve from the pressure. Placing individuals whose willpower has been severely weakened or eroded, into a living situation with several others who are more advanced in their thought reform, whose job it is to further undermine the individual's emotional supports. Using techniques of character invalidation, humiliations, revilement, shouting, to induce feelings of guilt, fear, and suggestibility.
I could count the men I did time around on one fucking hand. Straight up. Bitches! Bitches! Straight up, you'll see it. How the fuck can they not come out here and live right if they're so strong and so admirable and they're running in such a tight program? They don't!
Coupled with sleeplessness, an exacting prison regimen and periodic interrogational interviews. Meeting all insincere attempts to comply with cellmates' pressures with renewed hostility. Renewed pointing out to the prisoner by cellmates of where he has in the past, or is in the present, not been living up to his own standards or values. Rewarding of submission and subserviency to the attitudes encompassing the brainwashing objective with a lifting of pressure and acceptance as a human being. Providing social and emotional supports which reinforce the new attitudes. And, of course, as noted in the introduction to this edition of the journal, following Shine's address, then director of the BOP, James V. Bennett, encouraged the administrators and wardens throughout the federal prison system to put Shine's techniques into practice. We can manipulate our environment and culture. We can perhaps undertake some of the techniques Dr. Shine discussed. There's a lot of research to do. Do it as individuals. Do it as groups and let us know the results. That was in 1962. Since then the results have been compiled and evaluated many times over, and all but one of Shine's suggested techniques have been left intact at Marion, along with the addition of several new features. ABOP Policy Statement, October 31, 1967, Sanctions, after a test period, experimentation on prisoners when the benefit from the experiments are clear in terms of the mission and collateral objectives of the Bureau of Prisons and for the advancement of knowledge. In other words, prisoners are expected to feel inspired at the thought of advancing knowledge to benefit science and corrections. But what prisoner knows that he or she is aiding the development of behavior modification techniques to be used in controlling and manipulating not only other prisoners, but also segments of the public? Besides other things, he or she is denied knowledge of what he or she is involved in, or rather forced into. The truth of behavior modification is that it is applied to prisoners secretly, and sometimes remotely, via manipulation of the environment, experimentation in action. At Marion, these techniques are applied for punitive purposes, and only one subsection of the prison population is allowed any relief. First, a man's emotional and family ties are broken by removing him to the remote area of southern Illinois, and by enforcing a rule whereby he cannot correspond with community people within a 50-mile radius. Sometimes the rule slackens, but when the prisoner's correspondence expresses ideological perspectives, it is enforced more strictly. Families of prisoners who move into the area are often discriminated against and harassed by government agencies. Visitors complain of being intimidated by prison officials, especially when the visits are interracial. 3 occasions. For example, a man's wife, who had traveled from Puerto Rico, was stripped and searched. This caused great concern among prisoners, because it could happen to any one of their wives, mothers, or children. Another tactic to break a prisoner down is to punish him by removing one family and friends from his visiting list or by placing him on restrictive visits. These types of visits are conducted in an isolated, partitioned booth by telephone. Such restrictions often discourage families from visiting, especially when they have to travel long distances. Officially, close family ties are encouraged; practically, they are being severed. And more often than not, a man's family is looked upon and treated with the same disdain reserved for a criminal. Another method of separating prisoners from friends and outside supporters is the two-faced campaign waged by the prison administration. On the one side, prisoners are told they have been totally rejected by society, and that even those who pretend to be interested in them are only using prisoners for their own selfish benefit. By this, a prisoner is supposed to believe that he was never a part of a community or of society in general, that his ties among the people were never legitimate, and that their interest in him is a fraud. On the other side, a brutish, bestial, and sociopathic image of prisoners is presented to the public.
The purpose of the Mexican Mafia has been described by many as a premeditated effort to spread organized criminal activity throughout the Southwest.
The horror image further alienates the people from the captive, and it sometimes causes a family to fear their own loved ones. This further isolates the prisoner and makes him more dependent on the prison authorities. But discernment of this sophisticated system may be far beyond a prisoner's imagination, or even his comprehension. It is impossible for him to retain his sense of being, his human worth, and dignity, having been reduced in the eyesight of humanity to the level of an amoeba and placed under a microscope. He cannot understand why he feels the strange sensation of being watched, why it seems that eyes follow him around everywhere. He fears his sanity is in jeopardy, that paranoia is taking hold of him. It shows, the tension in his face, the wide-eyed apprehensive stares, and spastic body movements. Among the general prison population, paranoia tends to spread like wildfire from man to man. Everyone knows that the paranoid person is a walking state of danger. His mood throws everyone else out of equilibrium. The small world cannot contain the imbalance. A general alarm is sent out in hopes that someone can reach the individual before the disequilibrium ends with disaster. Sometimes the alarm is successful, sometimes not. In any case, the induced state of paranoia is a primary cause of the violence, which has occurred throughout Marion's history. The pervasive eyes at Marion are not without the complement of ears. Besides officers eavesdropping and the inside spies trying to collect enough intelligence to make parole, there are also devices out of view. Loudspeakers, for example, are also receivers, capable of picking up loose conversations in the hallways, cell blocks, and mess hall. Recently, a strange device, that someone called a parabolic mic, was found. It is hard to figure out exactly how many more such devices are scattered around the prison, embedded in the wall or situated behind cells. The administration is known for collecting an enormous amount of information on prisoners, some of which could only be gathered from such eavesdropping methods. Sometimes a prisoner is confronted with the information in order to arouse suspicion about the people he has talked with. At other times, the information is kept secret among officials, and traps are set. Most sacred of all is a person's ideas. There is a standing rule among the prisoners: never let the enemy know what you are thinking. At Marion, a man is labeled by his ideas, and his differential treatment is plotted accordingly. Thus, if a man's expressed ideas are at variance with the ideas and perception of the prison administration, behavior modification is used on him to reconcile the difference. What life boils down to is an essay of psychological warfare. An unsuspecting, or a prisoner unable to adjust and readjust psychologically and develop adequate defense mechanisms, can be taken off stride and wind up as another one of Marion's statistics. Prison officials and employees come well prepared, well trained, and well aware of the fact that a war is being waged behind the walls. Behavior modification and the misuse of therapy techniques. There is a small elite group in the prison population that is looked upon by the administration with great favor, because the group shares the same basic ideals with the administration.
If you want to beat the system, you have to become the system. You have to become the system.
The group's members see the prison authority as a parent. They think of themselves as residents rather than as prisoners or captives.
I was in the county so long at that time fighting my case. You know, when you're in a place for so long, you become a part of it. Meaning like you become staff without even wanting to. You know what I'm saying?
Because to change the word is to change the reality. And they believe the program in which they are being trained will make them qualified therapeutic technicians and help them secure a change in residency. At Marion, this program is called a Skulpion, which literally means nothing. The prisoners call the group Groders or Groders Guerrillas, named after the psychologist who implemented Dr. Shine's brainwashing program. The Groders live in a special cell block that, by prison standards, is plush. They are allowed luxuries and privileges which regular prisoners cannot receive. However, they are convinced that they earn these things because they are trying to do something to better themselves. Generally, they look on other convicts with contempt. When confronted with evidence that they are a brainwash group, they reject the proof and accuse other prisoners of being envious. But the reality speaks for itself. The program employs a number of noted therapeutic techniques, for example, transactional analysis, synonym attack therapy, psychodrama, primal therapy, and encounter group marathon sensitivity sessions. The administration's favorite is transactional analysis, TA. Essentially, TA propagates the theory that people communicate on 3 different levels: parent, child, and adult. These become character roles. It is up to the corresponding party to figure out which role the first party is playing, then communicate with the person on the proper counterpart level. What this technique actually does is create an artificial dichotomy between people, each straining to fit into the proper character role. Thus, communication becomes artificial, stilted, and utterly meaningless in its content. Everyone sounds like a pseudo-intellectual.
How the fuck can they not come out here and live right if they're so strong and so admirable and they're running in such a tight program? They don't!
Ultimately, it propagates the idea that the authorities always fit the role of parent and the prisoners must submit to the role of a child. Although some Groders pretend this practice is a fake-out on the man, it still is a real social practice. Changing the words to describe it does not change the reality. Other techniques include Dr. Shine's character invalidation. These techniques are incorporated under the auspices of game sessions, synonym attack therapy, and marathons, encounter group sensitivity sessions. In game sessions, members of the group accuse a person of playing games, not being truthful with the group, lying, and so forth, or the person is accused of some misdeed or shortcoming.
You know, I mean, these people are trained in all kinds of various psychology, right, to control the mind.
Before he is allowed a chance to explain, which is considered as only more lying, he is relentlessly barraged by dirty name-calling until he confesses or owns up to his shortcomings. He is then accused of making the group go through a lot of trouble and having to pry the truth out of him. For this crime, he is forced to apologize. Marathons are all-night versions of literally the same, except that they include local community people who come into the prison to be trained in the techniques. After so many hours of being verbally attacked and denied sleep, a person owns up to anything and accepts everything he is told. After being humiliated, he is encouraged to cry. The group then shows its compassion by hugging him and telling him that they love him. These techniques exploit the basic weaknesses in human, aggregative, nature, especially those weaknesses produced by an alienating society, i.e., the need to be loved, cared about, accepted by other people, and the need to be free. In turn, they are transmuted into submission and subserviency, the type of behavior conducive to the prison official's goal of control and manipulation. The Groders will not resist or complain. Nor will they go on a strike to seek redress of prisoners' grievances. They are alienated from their environment, and emotional interdependency welds and insulates them into a crippled cohesion, of the weak bearing the weak. They are not permitted to discuss these techniques outside the group, because one of the preconditions for admittance is a bond to secrecy. Yet almost anyone can spot a Groder because the light has gone out of his eyes. He literally wears the look of humiliation. Some years ago, the prison population wanted to do the Groders bodily harm because they allowed themselves to be used as guinea pigs, and because the techniques they helped to develop would be used on other prisoners and people in the outside world. In their lust for freedom, Groders would help to sell out an entire generation.
Environment, you chose to break the law. And you see, that's the problem. I won't embrace their victim stance, their victim role mentality of criminal justice reform. My plan was simple. You want to get out, you have to incentivize rehabilitation. You have to go through psychological treatment, deal with emotional intelligence, cognitive behavioral therapy, all these intelligence, cognitive behavioral therapy, intelligence, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Today, they are generally looked upon as mental enemies, so prisoners just leave them alone. Meanwhile, the brainwashing programs are still finding their way into communities in the outside world, under a number of pseudonyms other than Asclepion. And the Groders still have hopes of joining these programs when they are sufficiently spread. They will become therapeutic technicians. This is what Dr. Groder laid out in his master plan, utilizing prisoners as couriers of the techniques into the community. It is also what former warder Ralph Aaron meant when he testified at the 1975 Bono v. Saxby trial that the purpose of the Marion Control Unit is to control revolutionary attitudes in the prison system and in the society at large. What the Groders fail to realize is that, even as therapists, they will remain under observation long after their release from prison, under what is euphemistically called post-release follow-through. And what Dr. Groder fails to realize is that by camouflaging Dr. Shine's techniques under pseudonyms, whereby prisoners who volunteer for the program cannot recognize its real meaning and objectives, extensive violations of the Nuremberg Code have taken and are taking place. Even the implication of freedom as inducement for volunteers is considered a means of coercion by the Code's standards. The first principle in the Code proclaims, voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. Before an acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration and purpose of the experiment. There is much that is not explained or accounted for at Marion. Prisoners are left to discover it all on their own, via studying the prison and the prison system's history. In light of most of the discoveries one makes when learning this history, it should come as no surprise that some aspects at Marion are at variance with the Nuremberg Code. Chemotherapy, the misuse of drugs. Chemotherapy is administered 4 times daily at Marion. The loudspeaker announces, control medication in the hospital. Pill line. Valium, Librium, Thorazine and other chemical billy clubs are handed out like gumdrops. Sometimes the drugs mysteriously make their way into the food. For example, the strange month of December, 1974, recorded 5 unrelated, inexplicable stabbings. During the same time, 8 prisoners suffered from hallucinations in the hole and had to be treated with Thorazine injections.
The funny thing about being in there as well is the food itself and the way it would make you feel and the way it would make you act in certain circumstances or situations.
Drugs are often prescribed for minor ailments and are often suggested to prisoners as a panacea for all the psychological ill effects of incarceration. Some drugs such as Prolixin make prisoners want to commit suicide. Some attempt it, some succeed.
My understanding of Anectine and the gas treatment that they administered was simply for traumatic effect, to create trauma in your head where that you'll refrain from doing something that they consider against the rules, something that they consider a violation of the rules.
Segregation is the punitive aspect of the behavior modification program. It is euphemistically referred to as aversive conditioning. In short, prisoners are conditioned to avoid solitary confinement, and to avoid it requires some degree of conformity and cooperation. But the whole remains open for what prison authorities and Dr. Shine call natural leaders.
They, in 2006, started a short corridor, and some called it the gang corridor, short corridor with 4 cell blocks in it. And they opened that up for just validated members and isolated us even further from the other prisoners in the SHU.
These prisoners can be pulled from population on investigation and held in solitary confinement until the so-called investigation is over. During the whole ordeal, the prisoner is not told what the inquiry is about, unless he is finally charged with an infraction of the rules. If the Marion authorities think that the behavior modification techniques will eventually work on the prisoner, he is sent to short-term segregation. If not, they use the last legal weapon in the federal prison system, the long-term control unit. The long-term control unit is the end of the line in the federal prison system. Since there is no place lower in all of society, it is the end of the line for society also. Just as the threat of imprisonment controls society, so is Marion the control mechanism for the prison system. Ultimately, the long-term control unit controls Marion. Prisoners in the unit can feel the heaviness of this burden. knowing that it is a long way back to the top. Usually a prisoner does not know specifically why he has been sent to the control unit, other than that his ideological beliefs or his personal attitude toward prison authority is somehow wrong, and he usually does not know how long he will be in the control unit. A prisoner is told he is being placed on 30-day observation, and that he has the right to appeal the decision if he wishes. Until recently, most prisoners simply waived the appeal because they were given the impression that they would be getting out soon. One particular prisoner was told by the control unit committee that he would be getting out of the control unit after the observation period because they needed the room. Later he was given an indefinite period in the unit. That is the case with most prisoners. In the control unit, a prisoner only does two things: recreate and shower. Only one range of men, 18 out of 72, is allowed to work. Although everyone recognizes that the work is exploitative, it is generally considered a privilege. The rest of the control unit prisoners spend 23.5 hours a day locked in their cells. According to what state the man's mind is in, he may read or write. He sees the control unit committee for about 30 seconds once a month to receive a decision on his adjustment rating. He may see a case worker to get papers notarized, the counselor to get an administrative remedy, complaint, form, and a phone call authorization, on a maybe basis. He may see the educational supervisor for books. Other than that, he deteriorates. The cell itself contains a flat steel slab jutting from the wall. Overlaying the slab is a 1-inch piece of foam wrapped in coarse plastic. This is supposed to be a bed. Yet it cuts so deeply into the body when one lays on it, that the body literally reeks with pain. After a few days, you are totally numb. Feelings become indistinct, emotions unpredictable. The monotony makes thoughts hard to separate and encapsulate. The eyes grow weary of the scene, and shadows appear around the periphery, causing sudden reflexive action. Essentially, the content of a man's mind is the only means to defend his sanity. Besides these methods of torture, and they are torture, there is also extreme cold conditioning in the winter, and a lack of ventilation in the summer. Hot and cold water manipulation is carried out in the showers. Shock waves are administered to the brain when guards bang a rubber mallet against the steel bars. Then there is outright brutality, usually in the form of beatings. The suicide rate in the control unit is 5 times the rate in the general population at Marion. At the root of the control unit's behavior modification program, though, is indefinite confinement. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the control unit to communicate to the public. Yet a testament to this policy was a man named Hiller Red Hayes. After 13 years in solitary confinement, nearly 6 in the control unit, he became the boogeyman of the prison system, the living/dying example of what can happen to any prisoner. The more he deteriorated in his own skeleton, the more prisoners could expect to wane in his likeness. He died in the unit in August, 1977. In essence, the unit is a death row for the living. And the silent implications of behavior modification speak their sharpest and clearest ultimatum: conform or die. In several instances, the control unit has been used to silence prison critics. It has been used to silence religious leaders. It has been used to silence economic and philosophical dissidents.
It's the only proven cure that we've been able to come up with for people who are involved in multiple killings. The other alternatives that we have developed, I wouldn't care to be a party to, such as turning a man into a vegetable through a lobotomy, or planting electrodes in his brain so that when he feels a homicidal urge, he can push a button on his belt and maybe have an orgasm. To me, these kinds of things would be robbing them of their humanity, and I wouldn't want to be a part of that.
Once you start doing the tools, you're going to see the changes, the positive changes, and you're going to be able to do everything you set your goals to.
You can believe them because they're Gogi leaders. They're awesome. Pelican Bay Gogi leaders. They are awesome.
Gogi for life.
Gogi for life.
You may think it's brainwashing. It is. It brainwashes you to do